Story 1, The Ultimate Betrayal. For 6 years, I was forced to go undercover. My best friend stole my fiancée. I work for the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA. 6 years ago Jason, M26, was happily engaged to the love of my life Tracy, F25. My best friend was Frank. His father was gunned down by police when he was 12 years old, and since he had no family and he was my best friend, my parents decided to adopt him. He ended up becoming the golden child and was treated better than me, which I didn't mind as I knew they were just trying to help him recover from the trauma of witnessing his father's death. Jump forward to 6 years ago and my superiors call me in. They want me to go undercover, even though I wasn't an undercover cop. During the briefing I learned the real reason Frank's father, Ethan, had died. He was a founding member of the Reapers, a biker gang that covered a couple of cities and were heavily involved in organized crime. And so far they had been unable to place an undercover agent in the Reapers, but then they discovered my friendship with Frank and thought they could use this to place me undercover. I tried to refuse, letting them know that I was getting married in a couple of months and that my fiancée is pregnant. They had assured me it would only be for a week as they had received a tip-off that there was going to be a large meeting and I was only meant to find its location. In my family only my fiancée knew that I was a cop, mainly because of Frank. And I couldn't tell her that I was going undercover. So I told my family and fiancé I was going to be busy at work for the next week. The plan was that I would meet them to buy drugs and this would get my foot through the door. Surprisingly, they had actually agreed pretty fast, but that's where everything went wrong. Shortly after the meeting began there was a SWAT raid. Apparently someone had phoned in about a possible bomb. During the raid we were all arrested for drug trafficking. The next day I was taken to an interrogation room where my superior was waiting. I was expecting him to be there to release me, but he told me that somehow all of the arrested bikers had claimed that I was high up in the organization, which my superior saw as the perfect opportunity for me to infiltrate the gang. And when I tried to decline, he told me that I have two options. One, that spend years in prison, or two, I help them and be known as a hero. After calling him every name I could think of, I finally agreed since I realized that I had very little options. As per the plan, I received a 30-year sentence. My family was very disappointed in me for going to prison for buying drugs. I asked my best friend to watch my fiancée for me as she was 2 months pregnant, and he assured me not to worry, he would take care of everything. During the next 5.5 years I got lots of info that helped with the investigation, but I still couldn't get the information that we need about the leadership. This is when I was confronted by a group of bikers in the showers. They then beat me to a pulp. I was in hospital for over 3 months and the doctors didn't know if I would make it the first week. As soon as I could I passed on the information of who had stabbed me as well as which wardens were on duty. This actually turned out to be a break for the investigation, as using information I had already gathered they were able to get the names of a few of the higher-ups. And finally I was released. My parents were told that there had been a review of my case and that I was actually innocent. From their skeptical look I could tell they didn't believe it. When I asked them how Tracy was doing they tried to change the subject, but after a while told me that they didn't tell her that I was arrested but rather that I had died in a shootout between police and drug dealers. They didn't want her to wait 30 years for me to come out of prison, so they told her that I had died so that she moved on. Thus is when they dropped the next bombshell on me. She was engaged to Frank and they were getting married in 3 months. I demanded to use a phone so that I could call her. At first my father didn't want to but eventually gave me his phone. I called her number but Frank answered the phone. He told me that she doesn't want to see me but that he would come and see me in her stead. I met up with Frank at my parents' house. During the conversation he told me that he had helped Tracy and been there for her every day helping out with the baby. The baby was a healthy boy that Tracy named Jason in memory of me and that he was 5 now. After 3 years they had developed feelings for each other and had started dating. And then 6 months ago he had proposed to her and she said yes. After 6 years undercover I come home to my fiancée engaged to my best friend and my family thinking that I'm a criminal. After lots of arguing I finally managed to arrange to see my son next week. Okay, a couple of weeks have passed. I am temporarily staying at my parents' while arranging to find somewhere to stay. Over the last couple of weeks I have had quite a few arguments with my parents over their choice to pretend I was dead. I also learned that when they told Tracy a few days before my release that I was still alive and had been in prison, she had had a breakdown and was very emotional. If you were wondering why I'm not back at work, it's because I am on 3 months paid leave. After the last 6 years my superiors said that this is the least I deserve to try and get my life back together. A week after I made my last post Tracy was still not ready to see me, but I got to see my son. Seeing him almost broke my heart, the fact that he didn't know or recognize me, all the time together we lost. Little Jason is the sweetest kid. Even though he was wary of me, he was very friendly. I was able to see him once a week, and today I was pleasantly surprised to see Tracy. She looked like she had been crying. She then asked me why I had lied to her. I was totally confused. She wanted to know why I lied about being a cop and why I told my family to tell her I was dead. I denied everything and tried to tell her I had been undercover. She called bullshit and told me that she had believed me and thought that I had died trying to arrest drug dealers. For over 5 years she had believed this lie. And then when Frank proposed, she turned him down, saying that she was still mourning. He had then told her that she shouldn't mourn me as I was a drug dealer. And that's when she had told him he was wrong, I was a cop. Apparently he had been stunned speechless for a few minutes and then had called my parents up in front of her and asked them to tell her the truth, and so they had told her that the police had confirmed I was one of the drug dealers and they just didn't want to tarnish her memory of me, and that I had asked them to pretend I was dead because I was too ashamed to face her and to allow her to move on because I was going to be away for decades. A few days later she had accepted his marriage proposal and got engaged to him. No matter how much I tried to explain, she wouldn't believe me and asked me to please leave their lives, as her priority is her son Jason. And that in 2 months she is marrying Frank because unlike me he is a real man that doesn't lie to those he loves and isn't a criminal. After getting home, there was something that kept bothering me. I had been assaulted at around the same time as Frank and Tracy became engaged. So I have decided my holiday is over. Tomorrow I have to go back to work. It has been 2 weeks since my last post and unfortunately Tracy and Frank haven't allowed me to my son. But that has just motivated me to work harder. But I wanted to talk about Frank. We had been best friends. I even looked up to him. I thought he was so cool at school and he used to visit me all the time. He knew how to talk to people and so he easily got my parents to adore him. When we were 12 he didn't come to school for a couple of days and I had overheard the teachers talking about how he had witnessed the police kill his own father and what a shame it was that he had no other relatives and that he was probably going to end up in foster care. When I got home I told my parents what I had heard, and because they felt sorry for him they had reached out to the police, who had gotten them in touch with Child Protective Services, and to cut a long story short they ended adopting him. Now, the best friend that I looked up to was my adopted brother. We all felt sorry for him, especially my parents, and he got special treatment. And generally I didn't mind because I knew what he was going through, pain that I couldn't understand. But he could sometimes be mean and seduce a girl I liked, and afterwards he would act all innocent and convince me he was looking out for me. Because of how his father died there was one taboo in the house: the police. For a few years after his father's death, whenever Frank heard sirens or saw a police officer he would have a panic attack. It was so bad that we were forbidden about talking about the police and even changing the channel if anything police-related came on. He did eventually improve, but my parents still forbade it in the house. As we got older we drifted apart, though I still considered him my best friend, and when I finished school I moved out. There wasn't enough money to send both of us to college, so my parents were paying for Frank's tuition and board. And when I was about 20 I decided to join the police. Because I knew they would disapprove I didn't tell my parents or Frank. I just told them I worked in security. A year later I met Tracy. I would like to say it was love at first sight, but we actually didn't get along at first. She was my neighbor and I found out that she had a stalker, so even though we didn't get along I thought it best to walk her from her apartment to her car and vice versa when I saw her. At first she was rude about it, but eventually we started talking and became more friendly. We even went for coffee a few times. Until one day the stalker attacked her, but luckily I was nearby and was able to put him in a headlock until police arrived and took him away. She was in shock, so I don't think she noticed how I knew the officers. After this event I had no more reason to walk her to her car, so I asked her on a date and she said yes. That was how we started dating. A couple of months later I took her home to meet my parents. When I took her to meet my parents Frank was also there. And he was his usual charming self, but Tracy barely looked at him. My parents loved Tracy. At this time Tracy already knew what my job was but also knew to keep it a secret, which she did. A couple of days later Frank crashed his car and it had to go in for repairs. My parents asked me to lend my car to Frank as he needed it for college and his part-time job. I tried to explain I also needed it, but they eventually talked me into lending it to Frank. Not even a week after lending it to Frank he called to tell me it had been stolen. When I reported it stolen it was found within a couple of hours in a parking lot. The officer that found it noticed it wasn't locked, and when he opened the door noticed some drugs lying on the floor. If I hadn't been a police officer, I could have been in big trouble. Luckily, after an investigation, which included a drug test, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. At the time, I had thought that the car thief had dropped the drugs in the car by accident. 2 years later, I transferred to narcotics. I had just turned 24. It was a lot harder than before, with lots of pressure to have to constantly prove myself. And during all of this, I had kept in contact with Frank. And because of his bias towards the police, I never had to worry about running into any of my buddies from work when we went out together. And then a little over a year later, I proposed to Tracy and she said yes. When I asked Frank to be my best man, he had told me he would be honored to. And then 8 months later, Tracy had told me she was pregnant. I was so happy. I was doing a job I loved that challenged me, was marrying the love of my life, and was now going to be a father. My life was perfect. At least until 2 months later. Looking back at my relationship with Frank, I realized now that only I thought of him as my best friend. I had become so used to letting him get his way, at first because I felt sorry for him, but then later on because it had become the norm. Even as a cop, I allowed myself to be pushed around. Which is why I ended up going undercover in prison instead of calling my superior's bluff. And Frank had become so used to taking what he wanted from me that when Tracy didn't even look at him, he became obsessed with taking her from me. And he thinks he has won, but he doesn't realize that I am no longer the same man I once was. In prison, I had to learn to stand up for myself. If I let myself be pushed around, it would have been over. And my love for Tracy and my child will not allow me to lose. And now I have to get back to work. Well, next week is the wedding, but I have been very busy. Hopefully the investigation will be finished before the wedding. Just over 2 months ago, I learned that Tracy had told Frank that I was in the police. This, combined with when she told him, I suddenly felt many things that were puzzling me suddenly clicked together. Questions like how was my cover blown and why was I treated as if I had a high position in the Reapers? And also why they were so quick to meet with me and who called in the bomb scare. Luckily, he didn't know that I was a cop during the meeting, otherwise he would probably have had me killed and not just set me up. He didn't know that his actions would allow me to infiltrate the gang, or that his attempt to have me killed would backfire on him so badly. And that this would be what ultimately exposed him. He still doesn't know that I know that he knows I'm a cop. Mainly because Tracy has been avoiding me and refusing to let me even see my son. He thinks that he is in control of everything, but for the first time I am the one in control. When I went back to work, I asked to be put on the task force investigating Frank's gang. I know, you would think that because I went undercover I would be on the task force, but it was only originally meant to be for a week to find out a location, and then they would have handled the rest. And then when I was in prison, it was very one-sided. I would pass information to them and that was it. They were scared that too much contact would blow my cover. Luckily, they said that I had more than proved myself, and even if I hadn't asked, I would have been assigned to the task force anyway. Though I did embarrass myself a little by telling them that I believed that Frank was the real leader of the gang. I told them how his father had been a founding member and how he had been the one that blew my cover, and that he had even set me up to go to prison for a long time, and that this wasn't even the first time he had tried to set me up. They listened to my reasoning and they agreed with most of it except for one thing. They disagreed with me about Frank being the leader. He is too young and doesn't have the experience or respect. But they said that I had done a good job and that Frank was most likely their weak point. So they rearranged the investigation with Frank as the primary target of investigation. And the information obtained from my assailants was a lot of help in this regard. Frank was placed under 24-hour surveillance as well as all of his known associates. We also obtained warrants for his phone activity to see what calls he made, as well as for his bank accounts and email accounts. We actually didn't expect to find much this way, thinking that he would be using burner phones and have his money hidden in foreign accounts. But boy, were we wrong. He was so used to being in control and being the golden boy that he had used his own phones to call his criminal associates. And he even used his own bank accounts for his criminal activities, as well as his email accounts to send coded messages. We had already monitored the phone activity of the person, David, that had ordered the hit on me, but he had made and received so many calls that were mainly comparing it to numbers of known or possible associates. But going through Frank's phone activity, we found that he had made a phone call to David 3 days before I was assaulted and had made a payment into his account. And during his surveillance, we actually learned more about the criminal organization than we had ever known. He led us to drug dens and brothels that we didn't know about. And he regularly visited his father's best friend Capone, I think he earned his nickname because he looked a little like Al Capone but with more tattoos. After learning of his relationship with Capone, we started to put together how he fit into the gang. He must have been approached by Capone shortly after finishing school or possibly even in high school and became close with the gang. It was most likely because of his friendship with Frank's father and wanting to look out for his son. He was like an uncle to Frank, and because of coddling Frank we were able to get lots of evidence linking him to the gang. Apparently the task force had believed he had retired after his last stint in prison, but apparently that was because he had spent a lot of effort and money to make us think that. But now because of Frank he had been exposed. There was so much energy and things were moving so fast. The others kept telling me that this was the fastest the investigation had moved in a long time. That I might even get a commendation for all what I brought to the investigation. If everything goes as planned we will soon be able to deal significant damage to this gang. The only downer has been that the more I find out about Frank the more worried I become about Tracy and my son. But even though we have enough to convict Frank we need more information on the gang so that we can dismantle it once and for all. But we are almost there. Tracy's POV Part 1. 3 months ago I, F31, discovered that my current fiancé Frank, M32, and my ex-fiancé Jason's, M32, parents were lying to me. They had led me to believe that he had died in a shootout between police and drug dealers. I am about to get married in 3 days' time. I just wanted somewhere to vent about this. Let me start at the beginning. When I was 20 years old, Jason was a neighbor of mine. If I were to say I was unimpressed with him, that would be an understatement. He would let people push him around and didn't seem to stand up for himself. At the time I was a model. I didn't make a lot from modeling, but it was enough to pay for my rent and necessities with a little left over for myself. I had always heard that there was always the danger of stalkers, but I hadn't believed it until it happened to me. He had developed an obsession with me and would always appear at the places I was modeling as well as events I attended. Up till this point I was able to ignore it to a degree. But then he started appearing where I shopped and even near where I lived. And somehow Jason had heard about it and would walk me to my car and even offered to go shopping with me. I remember I was actually a bit rude to him. After all, how could someone so cowardly protect me? But somehow I actually started to feel safe and comfortable when he was around. I started getting feelings for him and even asked him out for coffee a few times. And then apparently the stalker started to get jealous or something, because one of the days the stalker suddenly attacked me with a knife in the parking lot, shouting that in death we would be together forever. Luckily Jason was there. When he tackled the stalker and put him in a headlock he looked so heroic. He didn't even flinch when the knife cut his arm. I think that was the moment I fell in love with him. When the police came all I saw was him. Until this moment I had thought he was a coward, but in that moment I saw what I believed was the real him. Without the stalker I was terrified that we would go back to being strangers. It's funny how he went from being a nuisance to someone that I couldn't imagine not being around. And then when he asked me out 2 days later I was so giddy. I had never felt this way before. After a couple of dates he came clean and told me he was a cop. That was how he had heard about my stalker and that he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. And when he told me that I couldn't tell his family because of Frank's trauma. His family wouldn't understand and it was just upset them, and I believed this. A couple of months later we went to meet his parents. And Frank was there. He had this smug grin on his face and undressed me with his eyes. I couldn't stand him. From the way Jason spoke of him, this was not what I expected. And every time I was alone with him he tried to flirt with me. To be totally honest, he disgusted me. And this seemed to upset him. A week later he crashed his car and Jason lent him his, which he didn't even watch because it got stolen. I still remember thinking that he had been petty and crashed his car on purpose because I was interested in him, because he knew that Jason would lend him his. And when they found drugs in the car I remember thinking that it wouldn't surprise me if it was Frank's, but now I know the truth. 3 years later Jason proposed to me and I said yes. That was the happiest day of my life. I was already planning out the wedding. And then 8 months later I found out I was pregnant. We were both so happy and the future looked so bright. And then 2 months later his parents phoned me and asked me to come over. They had something important to discuss with me. When I arrived Frank was also there and you could see that his mother had been crying. They told me that Jason was dead. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been shot in a gunfight between police and drug dealers. I remember thinking that he must have been one of the cops and that I couldn't tell them because I didn't want to tarnish their memory of him. And I also felt that if I told them the truth that would mean it was real. He was never coming back. Frank offered to help me with the baby and to be there for me, and his parents insisted I take him up on his offer. I was so heartbroken and saw that I just agreed. And over the next 2 years he didn't make a move on me and was just a friend who I came to rely on. But then we started to have feelings for each other, and then 3 years after Jason died we started dating. We had the full support of Jason's parents. 2.5 years later Frank proposed to me. I turned him down, saying that I was still mourning Jason and wasn't ready for marriage yet. We had an argument where he shouted that he couldn't understand why I was mourning that drug dealer. I remember in the heat of the moment I shouted back that he was a cop, not a drug dealer. He was so shocked that I thought Jason was a cop that for the first time ever he had a look of shock on his face. And that's when he told me the truth, or at least part of it. He told me that the truth was that Jason was one of the drug dealers. I refused to believe it, and so he called Jason's parents and they corroborated his story. They apologized to me for covering it up, but they didn't want to tarnish Jason's memory with me. I remember just breaking down and crying. 2 days later I agreed to marry Frank and I finally moved on. Until 6 months later Jason came back from the dead. Or to be more precise, prison. Frank and his parents apologized, saying that since Jason had been given a 30-year sentence they were scared that I wouldn't move on. And he was only released because of a technicality. I refused to see Jason and didn't want him to see my son, but his parents insisted that I let him see his son once a week. I agreed as long as I wasn't there. But after a few visits I decided to be there to make sure he didn't hurt my son. And he still tried to tell me he'd been undercover. He still expected me to believe his lies. So I told him that I knew the truth. That Frank and his parents had told me he was just a common drug dealer. And that I was no longer that innocent girl that would just believe his lies. After this I refused to speak to him or let him see my son. His lies weren't going to hurt my family anymore, and now I am just focused on my wedding and my future with Frank and my son. Jason's POV Part 5. Today was the wedding. I really didn't want to do it today, but today was the best day to arrest a large portion of the Reapers, including Capone, with minimal bloodshed. Turned out there is no leader. Or to be more precise, the leader had died a couple of years ago and there was infighting going on. Frank was a member of Capone's faction. So unfortunately we weren't be able to take down the whole gang, but it has suffered significant damage and Capone has no loyalty to the other factions, or hopefully he sees it that way. It was a beautiful venue. It was an outdoor wedding at a beautiful vineyard. I could tell that Tracy had chosen out the decorations. And when I saw her in her wedding dress I almost burst into tears at how beautiful she looked, but I am getting ahead of myself. We had replaced at least half of the staff with police officers. That had been tricky to manage as we had to do it last minute to avoid spooking Capone. And after all the guests had arrived we surrounded the venue. We had studied the area thoroughly using satellite imagery to find the best places to hide from their detection. Luckily Frank had been in charge of security and in true narcissistic fashion was lazy about. I seriously have no idea how he earned Capone's trust. I was very nervous because not only was I worried about Tracy and my son, but my parents were also there. Even though we had made allowances for any contingency, I couldn't stop myself from worrying. The time when their guard would be lowest was during the exchange of vows. And that was when we acted. Halfway through Frank's vows we acted. While we charged in from the surroundings, the undercover police had their targets and took them while they were still confused. It was over in minutes. The guests were in chaos. The bridesmaids were huddled together crying. Tracy had run straight to our son and was hugging him with tears streaming down her face. And Frank was still acting like he was in charge. Demanding to know what was going on. HIW dare we disturb his wedding, etc. I had been given permission that if the opportunity presented itself I would be allowed to arrest Frank. When I walked towards him he was still full of confidence. That was until I took off my helmet and he saw my face. That was my first time I ever saw him lose his composure. He actually tried to attack me, but I was able to easily grab his arm and twist it on his back. He had started swearing at me and telling that I would regret this, that I was messing with the wrong person. I just ignored him and started to read his charges. He was charged with human trafficking, selling and distributing drugs, prostitution, gambling. When I started listing off his charges, Tracy finally realized it was me and started shouting at me for being jealous and ruining her wedding out of spite. That was until I came to the charge of attempted murder. She then demanded to know who I claimed he had attempted to murder. And for the first time since the raid began I looked directly at her, and said me. I told her that 9 months ago I was attacked inside the prison and almost died. We were able to obtain evidence proving that Frank had paid for and arranged the hit. Suddenly for the first time she seemed to realize the uniform I was wearing and that this was an actual police raid, and at the same time she connected the time I was attacked to when she told Frank that I was a cop. Suddenly she went pale, her hands went to her mouth and she just kept saying no over and over again. At that moment all of the adrenaline from victory faded from me and I just felt like my stomach was full of ash. I went over to her but she was shaking and didn't want me to touch her. She was having a nervous breakdown and had to be sedated. This operation had gone smoothly. I would like to say it's because we are that good, but it was more to do with Frank's incompetence. He had never personally suffered a setback in his life and so believed he was untouchable. Frank, Capone, and the rest of them were all in cuffs within a matter of minutes. My parents wouldn't even look at me. I could see the guilt in their eyes. But I just ignored them. I will have to face them later, but not today. Tracy and my son were taken to her parents' house while we finished up. We had a lot of work left to do. The wedding was just the beginning. After Capone's arrest there were coordinated raids across the city at all of their businesses. We managed to seize drugs and weapons worth tens of millions if not hundreds. Many of my and Tracy's extended families are upset that I did the raid on her wedding day. They really seem to think I was in charge. And even if I know why we had to do it on her wedding day, if I was in charge I would have done it a day earlier. Not only for Tracy, but also my son. He was raised to see Frank as his father, and saw him being arrested in front of everyone. I hope he can recover from this and that Tracy can one day forgive me. But even if she hates me I couldn't let Frank stay around them. He is far too dangerous. Tracy's POV Part 2. My wedding was 3 days ago. The last 3 days are a blur. After the wedding apparently my parents took me home, but I was in such a bad state that I had to be taken to the hospital and placed under psych evaluation. They were scared I would hurt myself. Today I am doing a little better, but since I still can't talk about what happened they encouraged me to write about it, so here I am. I still remember how beautiful that morning was, and how I kept telling myself it was the happiest day of my life. It was an outdoor wedding. Frank had chosen the vineyard. The caterers had arrived early and started setting up, when Frank's side of the family started to arrive. He had told me about them. They were related to his bio dad, not to his adopted parents, though they were also invited. I remember hearing the revs of motorbikes and then a bunch of heavily tattooed bikers arrived. I remember that they had an air of danger about them. The leader, an older gentleman, had come to me and introduced himself as Capone. I remember Frank had told me about Capone. He was like an uncle to him and was called Capone because he looked like Al Capone. Maybe before he got all the tattoos, but right now I couldn't see the resemblance. They were a rough bunch and made me very nervous, but they were important to Frank, so I thanked them for coming and chatted with them for a while. I remember greeting Frank's parents and how happy they were. I remember thinking that when Jason introduced me to them they were nowhere near as happy. Eventually I went to get ready before Frank arrives. It's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. It was a beautiful white wedding dress. I had actually chosen this wedding dress almost 7 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to return it after being told Jason had been killed. I was going to get a new dress, but Frank told me he really liked this dress and wanted me to wear it on our wedding. Putting it on actually made me cry a little. I remember telling myself it was just nerves. I remember my father walking me down the aisle and seeing Frank standing by the podium looking so dashing. I remember seeing my son Jason standing there smiling, my little ring bearer. I remember when we got to the vows my mind went blank while Frank was saying his vows. And then suddenly chaos. Suddenly some of the staff suddenly attacked the bikers while men in tactical gear rushed in tackling the bikers while shouting for everyone to keep their hands where they could see them. The bridesmaids were screaming, while I rushed towards my son Jason and just hugged him tight trying to shield his body with mine. And Frank was still his confident self demanding to know what going on and that they would regret this. He only lost his calm when the police took of his helmet. Suddenly he went pale and looked like he saw a ghost. He then rushed at this man and tried to hit him but was easily thrown to the ground with his arm held behind his back. It was only when this man started listing off his charges that I suddenly recognized him. It was Jason. Frank had told me that Jason might try to do something at the wedding, but I couldn't believe he would do this. I so read and started shouting at him, words that I now regret, how he was being jealous and petty and even worse stuff. But he just ignored me and carried on listing the charges. I remember he got to the charge of attempted murder. How ludicrous, Frank couldn't hurt a fly. So I asked him who he had attempted to murder. And for the first time since he burst in, he looked directly at me and said something that smashed my reality. It was him. 9 months earlier Frank had put a hit on him in prison and he almost died. It was like I was doused in cold water. I had been in shock, so I hadn't noticed that he was in a police uniform. And 9 months ago that was when I had that argument with Frank and accidentally let slip that he was a cop. It was all my fault. Jason has almost died because I broke my promise to him about not letting his family know. Why didn't I trust him? I had a nervous breakdown and had to be sedated. Why didn't I trust him? Why did I choose to believe Frank? His family have been trying to contact me, but I have told the nurses and my family that I don't want to see them. I am not ready to forgive them and I don't know if I ever will be. For 6 years they had lied to me. And not only that, they were the ones who had pushed for me to let Frank help me with the baby. And had helped Frank gaslight me in regards to Jason being a cop. Even when I had brought up that I had seen Jason in uniform and had seen his badge, they had supported his reasoning of criminals dressing up as police to commit crimes. And what has also terrified me is once I calmed down I started to realize that all of Frank's family that had arrived were criminals. Criminals he had brought to my wedding where my son was. I had allowed a snake to enter my home, and if Jason hadn't exposed him I don't know what would have happened in the future. I have had family members contact me angry that Jason chose this day to arrest Frank. I don't agree with them. Even if Jason never forgives me, I will always be grateful that he got Frank out of mine and my son's life. In a few days I will be allowed to go home, but I don't think I can face Jason yet. I made a big mistake, and even though it was because I was fed lies by those I trusted, I should have had more faith in Jason. It feels like my heart is breaking. Like how I felt when his parents told me he was dead. Even though it hurts so much, how much worse must it be for Jason? At least I still have my family. Jason lost everything. Jason's POV Part 6. So, it's been a month since the wedding. I have been very busy. Capone and Frank were both denied bail, as not only were they a flight risk but also considered a danger to the public, well, specifically mine and Tracy's families. And for those of the Reapers that managed to get bail, there were very strict conditions. And they are under constant surveillance to make sure they don't go after us. With the trial officially starting next month, the prosecution is busy collecting statements and putting their evidence together. Because of my history with the gang and relationship with Frank, I have had to answer so many questions. This has been exhausting, especially since I don't know when they will call me in to answer some questions or to clarify some of my earlier answers. I have been asked the same questions so many times in different contexts. But I know it will be worth it. I have also been visiting Tracy's parents' house regularly. Both to try and see Tracy as well as to visit my son. It's heartbreaking seeing the fear in my son's eyes. Apparently he still has nightmares of the raid and I am the monster that beat up his father. His family as well as Tracy apparently have been trying to get him to forget about Frank and to see me as his father, and he has also been going to therapy. His therapist says that with time he will see me as his father, but that doesn't mean it hurts any less. As for Tracy, she had to spend a week in the psyche ward because she had a mental breakdown. I thought that she hated me for what I put her through and that she would never forgive me. But today she came out of her room to speak to me. Her parents took our son to the park to give us some privacy. She had lost a lot of weight in the month I hadn't seen her, and I could tell that she had very little sleep. And we were both so nervous that neither of us knew where to begin. Until suddenly she started sobbing and apologizing to me. Telling me that she should have trusted me and waited for me. Then I also started crying, telling her that I should be the one apologizing. If I had been open with my parents from the beginning about being a cop, this would never have happened, or if I had stood up for myself and refused to go undercover, even if I lost my job. And that we had both been victims of Frank's manipulations. We ended up speaking for hours. And she said that I mustn't listen to the naysayers. She was glad I exposed Frank. Just the thought of what could have happened if she married Frank was keeping her up at night. And we spoke about our son, and she reassured me that he was a strong kid and that he would be back to normal in no time. And we spoke about what we experienced during the last 6 years. We both became more comfortable around each other and moved closer together. And it started to feel like we had never been apart. For the first time in a long time I felt at peace. And then Tracy started to fall asleep and I let her cuddle against me while I hugged her. She looked so peaceful as she slept. I started to cry at the hardships this woman had to endure while I wasn't here and how strong she was. When her parents arrived back from the park with our son, they found us there cuddling on the sofa. They didn't say a word and just quietly took our son upstairs. I then had the best sleep I have had in over 6 years. Tracy's POV Part 3. 3 months ago I finally mustered up the courage to speak to Jason. At first it was very awkward. I couldn't stand this awkwardness between us, so I started crying and couldn't stop apologizing, and then Jason started apologizing. Turns out that the whole time I had locked myself in my room thinking that Jason hated me, he was also thinking that I hated him. We ended up speaking for a couple of hours and I felt so safe and comfortable. I had missed this. Jason is the only person that gave me such a strong sense of safety and of being loved unconditionally. I don't remember when, but I fell asleep. When I woke up we were cuddling on the couch and I felt better than I had in over a month. I actually thought we would get back together after this and everything would be like it was. But he never asked me out or to move in with him. He visited us regularly and hung out with me and our son. But then the trial started 2 months ago, and from what I heard the trial could take a year or two to finish, especially since it was such a high-profile case. And even though the trial has only just begun, there had already been a massive bombshell. And it hit Jason really hard. He was already struggling to forgive his parents, so after this I don't know if he ever will. Don't worry, they didn't do anything illegal. No, the bombshell was that Frank is actually Jason's half-brother. And when I heard this I also thought what you were thinking, Jason's mother, and had an affair with Frank's father, but no, that's not it. Jason's father, Alex, is both of their fathers. Apparently Frank's father was actually his grandfather. Apparently Alex had fallen in love with Ethan's daughter Stacy. And since Alex had a good job and Ethan wanted his daughter to have a normal life, he gave his blessing and they got married. And since Ann was one of her best friends, she was one of her bridesmaids. And then 6 months later Stacy was pregnant with him and the happy couple were over the moon. And then 3 months later Ann became pregnant and she claimed that the pregnancy was the result of a one-night stand and she didn't know who the father was. But when Stacy was near term, she came home a day early from visiting her father, accidentally heard her husband arguing with her best friend about the baby. She heard enough to know her husband was the father. Apparently she had confronted them and after a big argument she had taken the car to go to her father. But she was in such an emotional state that she ended up crashing the car. Unfortunately she died 2 days later in the hospital, but they were able to save the baby. Her father had been devastated. He had taken the baby and told his son-in-law that he was dead to him and wasn't worthy to be his grandson's father, and so he would raise him himself. And then Alex had married Ann. And then the real reason they took in Frank was because they were the only living relatives. And they learned from the social workers that Frank had been heavily abused by his grandfather. He was already a drinker, but apparently after his daughter's death he spent most of his time drinking and gambling, and he also came to resent Frank for his daughter's death. He used to hit him and tell him that if he had never been born he would still have a daughter. When Jason's parents heard this they had felt so guilty, they had pretty much abandoned with his abuser. And they both still felt guilty about his mother's death and they had sworn to make it up to him. He became their priority and Jason was relegated to the background. Jason is still coming to terms with this. This is just another one of their lies exposed. After my breakdown I had quit my job and had focused on my son and on my mental health. But I have also been thinking of the future. I have been thinking about becoming a social worker for a while now. Frank had talked me out of it. But now, hearing about Frank's childhood, I have decided to study to become a social worker. Jason has been fully supportive and even helped me sign up. I don't know what will happen with Jason. But I will wait for him no matter how long it takes. Jason's POV Part 7. While the trial has been going on for a year now, the first couple of months were devastating. If not for Tracy's support, I don't know how I would have been able to deal with finding out that my parents had been lying to me and that Frank was my half-brother from my father's first marriage. If Capone hadn't been talking his ass off trying to make a deal, I don't think would ever have found out. When I confronted my parents about it, they tried to make it sound more innocent than it was. When I asked them what the argument was about that Frank's mother had overheard, they kept trying to change the subject. When I asked them if it was because my mom had refused to have an abortion, my mother assured me that she would never have aborted me. That she loved me before I was ever born. My father was agreeing with her, but he wouldn't look me in the eye, and even he didn't seem to believe his own lies. But this wasn't the only bombshell. I remember that I used to think that Capone was so tough, but he was the first to ask for a plea deal. And from what he revealed, that's because he was used to snitching. And I got my answer as to how Frank had earned his respect. He had earned it by arranging his own father's execution by police. Apparently Capone had been arrested by the feds trying to smuggle drugs from Mexico. He had made a deal with them that if he handed over Ethan he would only serve 5 years. Now he knew about Frank's abuse, so he arranged to meet him and convinced him to help the feds in exchange for freedom from his father. And he even revealed to him the truth of his birth and that if he did this he could live with his real father and have a family. My parents never knew that Frank had known the truth. All the years he had used their lies as a leash to get what he wanted. Frank eventually agreed to help Capone and he passed on evidence to the feds and helped them build their case on his father. Eventually they had enough evidence to arrest Frank's father and so they told him to visit a friend that day. But Frank had other plans. He had bought his father's favorite liquor and so he stayed home and gave it to him as a present. He then went and made sure all of the guns were fully loaded. He then went and watched for the feds and when he saw them sneaking up he ran and told his father, who was now drunk, and handed him a loaded gun before going to hide. It's obvious what happened next. He didn't stand a chance. Apparently Capone knew all of this because Frank loved to brag about it. How no one gets to hit Frank and get away with it. And he was only 12. There were many more things he spilled about Frank. And the more I heard the more nightmares I had about him living with Tracy. Like that he used to sneak out to visit Capone when he was a child, and he used to love watching them beat up people. Capone even said that one time they were going to execute a snitch and he asked Frank to leave. But he refused to. And he says that when they had that man on his knees begging for his life and shot him in the back of the head. The expression on Frank's face still gives him nightmares. It was the same expression you see on a little kid at an amusement park. Apparently after that he refused to let Frank come anywhere near his business until he was an adult. But in everything else he gave in to every whim of Frank. After all, if Frank revealed to the gang that he was a snitch, next time it could be him on his knees begging for his life. And it could be Frank holding the gun. The more I found out about Frank, the more I realized how lucky I was. That he was such a narcissist and that he never took me seriously. That he thought of me as a joke. If he had taken even a little more interest in me, he could have found out I was a cop. And it would have been me dumped somewhere with a bullet in the back of my head. I know I need to stop thinking about these what-ifs, but every time I think of this my hands start to tremble. Not because of myself, but who would there be to protect Tracy and my son from him? Aside from the trial, things with Tracy and my son have been improving. He turned 6 a couple of months ago. And even though he still won't call me dad, he doesn't flinch at the sight of me anymore and lets me hang out. And Tracy is studying to become a social worker. She is good with children and she wants to save other kids from becoming like Frank. I'm fully supportive. We spend lots of time together. And even I can tell she wants us to be a family. But I can't. Not yet anyway. I want to focus on improving my relationship with my son and with each other. And I want this trial to be over first, so that the nightmare can be over and we can begin to rebuild our lives. Frank POV. For the first time in almost 2 years I have access to the outside world. I don't know if they think I am Houdini, but they have been watching me like a hawk. But I don't know if it's because my trial is almost finished, but they have started to relax a little and I was able to sneak in a smartphone. The prosecution is painting me as a monster. First there's Jason, that snake, supposed to be my half-brother but stabbed me in the back. Then there's my family that say they love me and they were so happy when I got engaged to Tracy and they didn't even care about Jason, but suddenly he's a cop and now he's a hero and I am out with the trash. And Capone, that snitch, he was like an uncle to me. But mark my words, I will have my day. Just look at my grandfather, he liked to beat me and said I was better off dead. Where is he now? And Jason. Jason, you might think you're the hero but you're still the same weak coward you ever were. I still remember when you brought Tracy home to meet the parents. But I knew then as I know now you aren't good enough for Tracy. All you are good for is my leftovers. And look what happened. If you had just let me have her like usual. I would have had my fun and then when I got bored I would have thrown her to you. But instead look what happened. I got rid of you and then with you gone for a little while she chose the better men. And don't worry Jason, when I get out I will come and fetch my property, so carrying on being my bitch like you are used to and look after her for me so long. Capone. If it weren't for me and they took my grandfather alive, how long do you think he would have survived? Unlike you, he wasn't a coward that squealed to the police the moment he was in handcuffs. And do you think you are safe now? That the police are protecting you. Don't worry, even if I don't kill you, there are many from our gang that want you dead. Never forget that snitches get stitches. All that I did was to survive. I only took that which belonged to me. The only mistake I made was thinking that a nobody like Jason couldn't be a threat. But even a coward like him can be used to by the police. They are always trying to take me down because they are scared of me, and they used Jason to do. That's right, Jason, you are only a tool. You were my bitch, but now you are theirs. But guess what? No matter who holds your leash, you are still just a bitch. Everyone thinks that I am done. But I am not done. I refuse to be done. I am Frank. Everyone else are just puppets dancing to my tune. And tomorrow I will sing and the jury will dance. Jason's POV Part 8. The trial ended last week and today was sentencing. Before I get to all that, I wanted to talk about what happened last week before the trial. My mother met me outside of the courtroom. She said that was the only place that she knew where I would be. I had blocked her and was avoiding her, and I was mostly at work or with Tracy and out son. She wanted to let me know that she had divorced my father. She had filed for divorce 6 months ago, but the divorce had only been finalized recently. She told me that she had always regretted marrying my father. That, after that drunken one night she spent with my father, when she found out she was pregnant, she should have confessed to her best friend. But she felt so ashamed. But even so, she refused to be pressured into an abortion. After the death of Frank's mother, she was a mess and so agreed to marry my father for my sake. And then when they adopted Frank, they became so focused on doing the right thing that they lost sight of what was important. And because I went along with it and was supportive of Frank, it just became the norm. That Frank was the priority. And Frank had convinced them that if they told Tracy I was in prison, it would destroy her future. That she would wait for me. He convinced them it would be better off if she thought I was dead. After that interaction, I entered the courtroom and sat near the back. To put it lightly, it was a farce. Frank got into a heated argument with his attorney. Apparently he thought that he could give the closing arguments instead of his attorney. And when his attorney refused to let him go up and speak to the jury, he tried to get up and do it anyway. The bailiffs had to be called in to restore order. Eventually, after order had been restored, his attorney made his closing statements. And eventually the jury went into closed session to deliberate. Within 15 minutes they returned and they found him guilty on all charges. In the morning 2 years of this trial, Frank has been calm and confident. But now for the first time he realized he wasn't going to win. And he started swearing and shouting as they dragged him away. And then he saw me at the back and he started shouting that it was my fault and that I must sleep with one eye open because he was coming for me. And then today was sentencing. He just sat there expressionless. Even when they passed his sentence. Life is prison without the chance of parole. All of the other reapers were also sentenced. The majority were custodial sentences. Capone received a 10-year sentence, with parole after 5 years. Well, his plea deal is responsible for most of the time the other reapers got. And his real father never even came to his sentencing. So much for the golden child. Tracy's POV Part 4. It has been a week since the sentencing and it feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders. Over the last 2 years, the relationship between Jason and our son has improved a lot. He hasn't called him dad yet, but I think that's just because it feels awkward. But he just needs a little more time. Jason had asked me to leave our son with my parents while he takes me out. He had something very important to discuss with me. I was very excited. I wasn't sure if it was a date or not, but I dressed myself as if it was. When I got to the restaurant, Jason told me how stunning I looked. I saw he had a folder with documents next to him, so I was a little disappointed, but I didn't let it show. We first had dinner while having small talk. Both of us avoided talking about Frank. We talked about his mother. It seems he has decided to give his mother another chance and forgive. His father hasn't even tried to contact him. He most likely knows that Jason wants nothing to do with him. After dinner and a glass of wine each, Jason opened the folder. He told me he had been given a commendation but that he turned it down. Not only that, but he also handed in his resignation. Apparently he had already decided to do this 2 years ago, and the only reason he waited was that he wanted to first see Frank sentenced. There was too many bad memories and he wanted to do something different, but where he was still helping people. He was going to be a private investigator, and specialize in missing person cases. He will make his money from high-profile wealthy customers, and he will use this money to do pro bono cases for those without money. He showed me his business plan as well as his PI license. I was happy for him. And then he accidentally bummed one of the documents onto the floor. He quickly apologized and ducked down to pick it up. Next thing I noticed, he was on one knee with a ring in his hand. He asked me if I would marry him. I burst into tears. I must have said yes like 10 times. I had started to think that he hadn't asked me out because he didn't want me. But the whole time he had decided to pause his life until Frank was gone for good. And now we are at a new beginning. For Frank it is the end. For us it is just the beginning. Jaden's POV Part 9. The last year has been the best year of my life. I quit my job and proposed to Tracy a year ago. We immediately moved in together. My son even called me dad 6 months ago. Both me and Tracy got very emotional. And my new job as a private investigator has been doing well. In most cases it involved runaways, but there were a few abductions. In all of the cases my contacts in the force proved invaluable. And my relationship with my mother improved. She loves to spend time with her grandson and babysits him when me and Tracy go out or when we want a romantic evening together. And Capone is dead. He was sent to a different prison from the rest of the Reapers because they feared for his life. But he made a big mistake at the prison they sent him. He joined white supremacist gang. After a few weeks they got hold of his papers and oh boy were they not happy about a known snitch in their gang. So they kicked him out of the gang. For the next 6 months he was extremely paranoid. He was now branded as both a snitch and a racist and he had no friends. I don't know what he experienced in those 6 months, and I don't want to know. But he was found dead in the shower. Apparently he slipped and hit his head against the wall, repeatedly until his skull caved in. And no one saw anything. And I have just gotten married. We got back from our honeymoon yesterday. We spent a week in Paris. It was beautiful. Tracy loved every minute of it. As for the wedding, we decided not to have a large wedding. We invited only close friends and family. My mother was there as well as some of my friends from the force. Tracy had her parents and friends. It was a beach wedding and we had timed the I-dos to occur at sunset. It was very emotional. And Jason, our son, was the ring bearer. He was grinning the whole time. My father wasn't invited. I haven't spoken to him in a year, but last I heard he had gotten some poor girl pregnant. Even though no one was surprised at the news, I was a little disappointed. I had hoped that one day in the future we could have repaired our relationship, but I no longer think that is possible. And I did receive some news about Frank. When I got back from the honeymoon I received a call from a friend on the force. He was letting me know Frank had been stabbed. Apparently he had somehow found out about the wedding and started acting out by swearing the wardens and other prisoners, even using racial slurs. He really thought his gang made him invincible. So he ended up getting shanked. He got rushed to medical where they were able to save him. I remember I just thanked my friend for letting me know. Before I hung up he said he thought I would have had a larger reaction. And then I realized that I actually didn't care. I was no longer living in Frank's shadow. Whatever happens to him has nothing to do with me. All that matters to me is my family. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and hit that subscribe button to follow cheating love stories for more amazing videos. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.